Today on The Nation Speaks, FBI numbers show that Jews are by far the biggest religious group targeted in hate crimes. But how often do you see protests or social media campaigns to condemn it? You don't. Brooke Goldstein, executive director of the Lawfare Project, explains why. Then in America Q&A, we ask people across the country why they think there is so little public outcry over anti-Semitism. Next, COVID-19 isn't going away, but what about the pandemic of fear and anxiety that's come along with it? How are psychiatrists responding to that crisis? Our guest psychiatrist, Dr. Aruna Tummala, explains what many are doing wrong and what they could be doing right. Finally, in our second America Q&A, we ask if you think the country is going in the right direction. Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. Racist attacks against Jews in America are disturbingly high, yet they get little attention, despite our heightened awareness around racism and minority rights these days. The FBI's most recent stats will probably surprise a lot of people. Last year, 56% of religiously motivated crimes were against Jewish people. That's while Jews make up less than 2% of the U.S. population. To compare, Muslims were the next most targeted group, experiencing less than 9% of religiously motivated crimes, while they make up about 1% of the population. So what is feeding this trend? And why, in an era of hypersensitivity to racism, is there so little outcry when Jews are the ones being targeted? I sat down earlier with our next guest to find out why. Joining us now to answer these important questions is Brooke Goldstein, a human rights attorney and director of the Lawfare Project. Brooke, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy that you're asking these questions because you are absolutely right. There is a total failure, whether it's on behalf of politicians or the mainstream media or human rights groups, to recognize that Jewish people are the highest victims of hate crimes right now. In fact, the FBI just released a report that Jewish people are 1/3 of all of the hate crimes in all of the United States. That means that they are 3 times more likely to experience an anti-Semitic attack, a hate-motivated attack than, for example, the Muslim community or the Black community. And yet that's not reflected when we see reporting of minority rights issues. And I think one of the reasons is because anti-Semitism has become politicized. Now, what do I mean by that? The foreign conflict between Israel and its neighbors, or Israel and the Palestinians, is often used as an excuse to justify hate crimes against the Jewish community.
Can you explain that a little bit more? Because a lot of people do make that connection quite directly and naturally. So explain why that's problematic.
Absolutely. So the equivalent would be, for example, saying that I'm angry at the Chinese government for their handling of COVID. Therefore, I am justified to turn around to a Chinese American and discriminate against them. Most people would recognize that as bigotry. If you had a problem, for example, with the state of Iran, you can't turn around to a local Muslim and project your problems with a foreign country on that person because of their ethnicity, because of their religion, because of their national origin. But that's exactly what is happening to Jewish people, that the anger with the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict is being used as an excuse to target Jewish Americans. This is not a political issue. This is a civil rights issue, and it must be treated as such. Jewish Americans are being targeted because of their religion, because of their ethnicity. Israeli Americans are being targeted because of their national origin, and this is racism through and through.
This seems particularly virulent, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, on campuses. I know that the Anti-Defamation League and a few other groups recently put out a report that found that anti-Semitic incidents during the 2020-2021 academic year reached an all-time high of 244 incidents, and that's despite campuses being closed. What does that look like exactly on the campuses, and why do you think there it is so prevalent?
Well, as a lawyer at the Lawfare Project, I can't tell you not 1 week goes by where we don't get a phone call from a student, from an academic, from parents of students describing the most horrific situations where Jewish students are being harassed. They're targeted. One of my clients, Jonathan Carton, was spat at for the sole crime of being Jewish. We are seeing an incredible rise of radicalization. This has been happening, I think, for the past 10 years on American college campuses. And we have to ask why. I think one of the important factors in this, but by no means the only factor, is the millions and millions of dollars of foreign funding from states like Qatar, which is the second largest terror sponsor in the world, to our institutions of higher education. And that funding is going towards hiring radical teachers and teaching a radical curriculum that's not just full of Jew hatred, it's full of anti-Americanism. And that's what we really have to pay attention to, because where you have racism and rising bigotry against Jewish people historically, that also is a measure of radicalization of the population in general. And the fact is that there is no transparency whatsoever. There are so many loopholes in American legislation that we've reached the point that the millions of dollars of funding from foreign countries is not even being reported to the U.S. government, even though we have laws like the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
There's another report that recently came out by the Heritage Foundation that I'd like to get your comments on and to understand maybe better what the connection is. The report is called Inclusion Delusion: The Antisemitism of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Staff at Universities. They analyzed the Twitter feeds of over 740 of these DEI staff to see if their online behavior promoted tolerance. They found this: anti-Israel attitudes that are so out of proportion and imbalanced as to constitute anti-Semitism. Of the tweets they analyzed about Israel, about 96% were critical of the Jewish state, accusing Israel of engaging in things like genocide, apartheid, settler colonization, ethnic cleansing, while 62% of the tweets about China were favorable. And China is the biggest national security threat that we face. What do you make of the connection here?
Well, look, there is an absolute obsession with Israel. Israel has replaced the Jew, and Zionism is used often as a euphemism for Jews. And this obsession with criticizing Israel has created a campus environment where academics and students now are unable to separate between what is happening 3,000 miles away and how they should treat Jewish American students.